troops flooded home from Vietnam. President Nixon stunned the nation by suddenly ordering the invasion of Cambodia in 1970.
There were times in Cambodia when I was frightened as I've ever been.
2 years later, there were so few U.S. troops left in South Vietnam that the North Vietnamese decided to go for broke in the 1972 Easter Offensive.
All 10 fire bases fell to the North Vietnamese. They just simply blew them away.
It took a massive U.S. air and naval bombardment to finally drive the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam.
My first reaction was great relief. Like, God, it's over.
During the presidential campaign of 1968, Richard Nixon said he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. But at the same time, he was working behind the scenes to sabotage President Johnson's ongoing negotiations with the North Vietnamese, knowing that an end to the war might help re-elect the Democrats. Nixon's strategy propelled him to the White House, where he vowed to bring America peace with honor.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he faced a hard truth about Vietnam.
Of President of the United States.
President Nixon realized that public support for the war was waning, but at the same time, he didn't want to lose the war.
So while he began withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam, he also sent the North Vietnamese a strong message.
He was not willing to abide by the same limitations as his predecessor.
Which meant that now nothing was off limits, including neighboring countries that were ostensibly neutral.
Part of Nixon's plan was to extend the war and try to take out enemy sanctuaries, Cambodia and Laos.
So on May 1st, 1970, Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese supply and logistic bases. Spearheaded by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, 4,000 soldiers, 51 tanks, and 250 armored vehicles crossed the border at first light.
The tanks opened fire with 90mm cannon and their 50 caliber machine gun.
Colonel Don Starry, 45, from Kansas City, Kansas, was the regiment's commander.
Because we had determined from listening to their radio that they knew we were coming, I elected to lead with the tank company. Bigger, heavier, more firepower, lots of armor protection.
Lieutenant Colonel Grail Brookshire, 37, of Stone Mountain, Georgia, was in the lead unit crossing the border.
When we made contact, we'd spread out. We were firing machine guns, tank guns, artillery.
2,000 North Vietnamese regulars initially fought back, even though they were badly outnumbered and outgunned.
We had some fighters overhead with napalm and 750 high-drag bombs under the wings. We put the artillery in this way, and we put the fighters in that way. Once we started the firepower after them, they broke and ran.
We took very few casualties at that point. We came out pretty much unscathed.
With the enemy on the run, the Americans began looking for North Vietnamese supply sites.
We made about 5 or 6 kilometers, began to get into the cache sites, so we spent some time trying to define the cache sites, find out what we had on our hands, and make an estimate of what it was going to take us to get it out of there.
The Americans found huge amounts of weapons and ammunition, so they quickly moved to try to cut off any North Vietnamese effort to move their remaining supply sites. Orders came down for 11th Cavalry to secure the town of Snool, about 30 kilometers away.
Our mission was to cut the roads that came out of the town, prevent the North Vietnamese from moving their supplies out.
The soldiers passed through several small Cambodian villages on the way to Snool.
As we went through, people were waving. Some places looked pleased to see us. At least we thought they were. I know my soldiers were throwing sea rations and candy to them as we pressed on.
As units from the 11th Regiment neared Snool, they were forced to cross a rubber plantation that surrounded the town. Dug in behind the plantation's airstrip were several hundred North Vietnamese.
A pretty heavy fight broke out in and around the town.
The tanks and other tracks charged through the rubber plantations, blazing away at the fortified and camouflaged bunkers, driving right over them.
Covering the 11th Cavalry's fight at the rubber plantation was John Lawrence, then a 31-year-old CBS News correspondent.
There were times in Cambodia when I was frightened as I've ever been, particularly when the armored personnel carrier I was in was surrounded by North Vietnamese troops and fighting its way through a bunker complex outside Snool. It was the only time in the war that I actually took part in military operations. I was passing ammunition to the machine gunners on the track. I wasn't able to be an impassive, journalistic non-combatant. I had to help out when it was needed. It isn't possible to be passive when your life's in danger.
Lieutenant Colonel Grail Brookshire had his own concerns.
I think my greatest fear was, in suffering a disaster and losing a lot of my troops. I was more concerned about that than I was any other single thing. I mean, I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to be the guy in command of a disaster either.
For a while, the fighting was intense.
It wasn't a cakewalk. Some guys got hurt, some guys got killed, some equipment got destroyed. It was probably the toughest fight we'd had.
One of Starry's toughest moments occurred when he charged an enemy bunker complex during the plantation fight. He ended up face to face with the North Vietnamese.
I stuck my M16 in the stomach of the captain in command, obviously in command because he's standing there giving instructions.
While Starry tried to convince the captain to surrender, one of the North Vietnamese suddenly threw a grenade into Starry's group.
Well, it got all 6, 7 of us, I guess, some worse than others. I had by count, about 20 holes of one size or another in me.
Other Americans cut down the grenade thrower and forced the North Vietnamese in the bunker to surrender. Starry and the other wounded were choppered out as fierce fighting continued at the sprawling rubber plantation.
We overran that, took the airfield. The fighting in and around the town got pretty intense by this time.
Once inside the town, 11th Armored Cavalry found the North Vietnamese well entrenched. So Brookshire called in airstrikes, which drove out the North Vietnamese.
The battle was over, but needless to say, there were many Cambodian villagers, many casualties among them.
CBS News correspondent Richard Threlkeld was with the American soldiers the next morning when they went into Snool.
The Americans, as was always their wont when they ran across civilians, the medics came in and tried to patch up as many as they could to help the kids, to try to, in their little ways, to put things back together. Cambodians were amazed because these people who had attacked them only 24 hours before now were there to help them.
Some of the American troops, however, began looting Snool's damaged stores. Lieutenant Colonel Brookshire emphasized that his orders were no looting.
As far as civilian property is concerned, our instructions to them and what we've been doing is just leaving it in place, hoping the civilians will come back in and recover it.
It was not our policy to allow the soldiers to pick up souvenirs or anything, and so we made them put it back.
The looting story, however, was broadcast in the United States,
Moving across campus to the education building.
only increasing the domestic firestorm that had erupted over the invasion of Cambodia.
It bothered me considerably that these people were, in effect, supporting the folks we were fighting.
Soldiers were flat mad about that. Here we are out here getting our butts shot off, risking that anyway. And here these people are back there having demonstrations and raising Cain about it.
I resented it. I still resent it.
Leave this area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
One protest on May 4th, 1970, at Kent State, created a national uproar when National Guardsmen fired rifles into a group of students, killing 4 and wounding 11, and creating a picture that has stood the test of time more than any image from the invasion itself.
There weren't going to be any good stories come out of Cambodia. And, we got slammed for that. And, it shouldn't have happened. It did.
At the end of June, the Pentagon ordered all American troops out of Cambodia. 338 Americans had been killed and another 1,525 wounded during the 61-day invasion. Despite the losses, the military counted the operation a success.
The invasion of Cambodia set back the North Vietnamese. Several of their staging areas had been destroyed. Huge stockpiles of weapons and ammunition were captured.
The success, however, didn't last long.
As soon as we pulled out, they could reestablish their bases again. And the outcry at home is immense.
And that outcry indeed helped convince the administration to maintain its rapid withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Vietnam. It was just what the North Vietnamese were waiting for. By 1972, there were only 60,000 American combat troops left in South Vietnam, down from more than 500,000 just 3 years earlier. Under the Nixon administration's Vietnamization plan, most remaining U.S. troops were acting as advisors to the South Vietnamese Army and Marines, who were now doing most of the fighting.
From the North Vietnamese perspective, the time was now right to launch a large conventional attack which they hoped would topple the government of South Vietnam and destroy its forces.
So on March 30th, 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a massive attack against South Vietnam.
The idea is to just exert enough pressure on the South Vietnamese army and cut the country in half, and everything would collapse.
The Easter offensive was a near complete surprise to both the Americans and the South Vietnamese. Although they had indications that the North Vietnamese had been building up, the timing and location of the thrusts caught the Americans and the South Vietnamese by surprise.
One of the main thrusts of the invasion penetrated Quang Tri province, just south of the demilitarized zone.
They came with massive amounts of infantry troops, good artillery support.
Colonel Jerry Turley, a 42-year-old senior Marine advisor from San Diego, California, had just finished lunch on Thursday, March 30th, 1972, when the North Vietnamese attack began.
We ran for a big bunker. We were at the I-2 combat base about 10 miles south of the DMZ.
Turley immediately began monitoring radio reports from South Vietnamese fire bases that were strung out along the 15 miles of the DMZ.
Within the first 12 hours, 2 of those bases fell. Within the first 48 hours, all 10 fire bases fell to the North Vietnamese. They just simply blew them away.
The main thrust of the North Vietnamese attack developed down Route 1 toward the town of Dong Ha, just north of Quang Tri City.
We could see actually flashes of artillery. I remember that vividly.
31-year-old Marine Captain John Ripley from Radford, Virginia, was the American advisor to a battalion of South Vietnamese Marines that got orders to move north.
We got as far as Dong Ha, which was the last village in Vietnam before you got to the militarized zone.
While waiting for orders, Ripley heard from Colonel Turley at I-2 Fire Base that for the first time in the war, the North Vietnamese were using tanks. Tanks that were heading straight for Ripley's position.
Even today, I can feel the cold chills. When I heard that message, it just rocked me back.
I saw through binoculars North Vietnamese tanks in the distance. I never thought I'd ever see them. And it was something which I'll never forget.
In Dong Ha, covering the North Vietnamese invasion, was 30-year-old CBS News correspondent Bob Simon.
High-ranking American officers say this will be the big test for the South Vietnamese army. But thousands of South Vietnamese civilians have decided not to wait for the results.
As the civilians fled Dong Ha, North Vietnamese guns began ranging the city.
It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. And I'd seen a lot of artillery, and yet this was amazing. They were systematically destroying the city to prepare for their advance with infantry and their tanks.
The only thing standing between the invading North Vietnamese forces and the city of Dong Ha was a bridge over the Cam Lo Qua Viet River.
I told, I believe it was Colonel Turley, I said, I've got to blow the bridge. The bridge cannot stay, we can't deal with tanks.
Turley tried to get approval from Saigon to blow the bridge, but no one would give permission.
When it became obvious that it was either blow the bridge or lose the battle, I said, go to hell, I'm going to blow the bridge. And that's when I ordered John to the bridge.
Roger, let me know soonest.
Ripley enlisted the help of a reluctant South Vietnamese tank commander to lend him 2 tanks.
We traveled roughly a mile from that location up to the bridge. It was one of the most amazing rides I've ever been on in my life. Artillery hitting on both sides, the road cluttered with dead refugees, bundles of goods and clothing, blown up vehicles, ox carts, all sorts of livestock dead.
Ripley crawled out under the bridge into the channel dangling between the I-beams.
I had to position these explosives in each channel. Time consuming because I had to position them, come around, swing over to the next channel, come back. Roughly 12 times it took me to do that. And then I had to put detonators in place. All of that took, my estimate, about 3 hours.
Because it took so long, Ripley was convinced he would be killed trying to blow the bridge. He worried about the impact news of his death would have on his family.
They're constantly in your mind. And then, the worst part of that is, you know, the terrible grief that you're going to put them through, and so you feel responsible for hurting them. Maybe you could say you don't have anything to do with it, but you got everything to do with it. I mean, you're going to tear their hearts out.
Miraculously, Ripley managed to place the explosives, set the detonators, and run for cover unscathed.
And the bridge blew up. I didn't see it coming. I didn't have any idea when, but it was such a huge explosion. It just blew me and everybody around us, just blew me through the air. And when I rolled over, I looked up and I could see big chunks of the bridge just everywhere in the air. An absolutely beautiful sight.
I don't know any other single individual act that was so compelling to stop an attack.
While loss of the bridge stopped the tanks, it didn't stop the North Vietnamese infantry.
They began to surround us from the flank. And finally, after about 6 days, we were down to roughly 300.
Eventually, Ripley's outnumbered and outgunned Marine battalion was forced to withdraw from Dong Ha.
I remember the incredible firmness of the battalion commander, literally stand and die, knowing that his mission was implacable, irreversible, and that his only choice was to fight a good fight, die a good death.
With American combat troops almost all gone by the middle of 1972, the North Vietnamese felt confident enough to come out of the jungles and fight a conventional war.
They believed that American combat forces, there weren't enough American combat forces to affect their conduct of the war.
The United States, however, responded immediately.
As Nixon was pulling American forces from South Vietnam, he was still did not want to be the first American president to lose a war. So again, he reversed himself and applied American combat power. But significant in the Easter offensive, it was air power and it was not ground power.
Launched on April 2nd by the 7th Fleet operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, Operation Linebacker was a massive air and naval bombardment aimed at stopping the advancing North Vietnamese.
The targets were large troop concentration, armored concentrations, supply bases, anything that they could do to destroy both the logistical and the combat power of the North Vietnamese divisions conducting that offensive.
Waves of B-52s and Air Force fighter bombers joined Navy and Marine planes from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, bombing the North Vietnamese.
The orders came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but it was very clear that there was a tremendous White House support.
Admiral James Holloway, 50, from Washington, D.C., was the commander of the 7th Fleet off the coast of Vietnam.
By going right after the spearhead, we were able to give the South Vietnamese some breathing room because they had to bring up forces, mobilize troops, and come up on the line.
Holloway allocated 3 of his 6 aircraft carriers for Operation Linebacker's bombing missions.
Our job as a forward air controller was to find the targets, identify the targets, and direct the heavier strike aircraft against those targets.
24-year-old Darrell Whitcomb from Long Beach, California, flew forward air controller missions in an OB-10.
It was a twin-engine aircraft, high-wing, turboprop engines with a big square tail.
Because OB-10s were slow and flew close to the ground, they were easy targets for enemy ground fire, and they were defenseless.
In most cases, our ordnance that we carried were the 2.75-inch smoke rockets designed specifically to hit the ground, explode, and put up a large puff of smoke.
Marking targets for U.S. bombers was dangerous work.
When the guns are on you, especially if they're tracking with radar and the rounds are coming in especially close, it'll get your attention, and it always caused me to have a very serious lump in my throat. And there was, I hate to admit this, but there was a few times when I had to go home, and after I landed I had to change my flight suit.
Despite the continuous air and naval bombardment, the North Vietnamese had managed to control most of the northern part of Quang Tri Province, 3 weeks into the offensive.
We're falling back on Quang Tri City. We have naval gunfire ships off the shore. One time I had 14 ships shooting naval gunfire to support us.
Marine Colonel Jerry Turley was advising the retreating South Vietnamese forces.
We tried to hit as many of their troop concentrations, and they were everywhere. It was target rich. We just didn't have the time, the artillery guns to hit it. It was the best we had.
But the U.S. best wasn't good enough, at least not yet. Quang Tri City was in enemy range.
They began to shell the capital of Quang Tri, which caused massive panic, and 25,000 people hit the roads. The road was filled with vehicles, carts, oxes, children.
Quickly, the North Vietnamese moved to cut off escape routes from Quang Tri City.
We heard an enormous explosion and turned around and saw a mushroom-shaped cloud rising up from the road.
Covering the fight for Quang Tri City was CBS News correspondent Bob Simon.
I was there with Norman Lloyd, one of the world's great cameramen. It turned out that the North Vietnamese had mined the road, and a bus full of refugees had run over the mine. And by the time we got to the road, it was just strewn The dead, the almost dead. A lot of women, a lot of children. And we were both, Norman and I think, transfixed by the scene. He just was almost glued to his eyepiece. For the first time, I freaked out, and I said to Norman, let's go. And Norman didn't even answer. He was just so glued to his eyepiece. And finally I ended up screaming, and he still didn't hear me. So I just physically took him and shoved him in the car. And then I got in the car after him, and we drove off. And about 20 seconds after we drove off, a mine went up exactly where we'd been standing.
We could see another truck coming down the road, another truck full of refugees, and as it got to the spot where we'd been, it ran over a mine, another mine, and it blew up, and people were flying through the air.
What they were doing against those civilians that were trying to flee the fight, get away from it all, was horrible. And I remember that particular day, I almost went into a rage as I tried to do everything I could to destroy those guns or make those guns stop firing. The stench created by the wanton killing and destruction of those people in such vast numbers, the stench was overwhelming, and I could smell it as high as 5,000 feet, and it stayed there for many days.
By the 29th of April, the North Vietnamese began their assault on Quang Tri City.
We had 3 units fighting to defend the city of Quang Tri.
American advisor and Marine Major Jim Joy, 37, from Marysville, Missouri, watched the North Vietnamese drive straight for the Citadel, a fort built in 1824 with thick 20-foot-high walls at the center of Quang Tri.
There was enemy contact all along our front lines as the NVA came across the river. We fell back gradually. It was not a major, we weren't overrun.
There were just too many NBA for them, and they've been in combat for since Easter, and perhaps it was too much for them. Rangers are good troops, but they can only take so much.
On May 1st, the ARVN general in charge ordered his troops to abandon Quang Tri City.
Evacuate to the south, down along Highway 1 to another river about 12 kilometers south of the Quang Tri River, My Chan River.
There at the My Chan River, the South Vietnamese finally were able to set up a defensive line that stopped the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese not only swept across the DMZ during the 1972 Easter Offensive, they also poured across the Cambodian border, the same area American troops had invaded just 2 years earlier, trying to clean out North Vietnamese sanctuaries.
One of the North Vietnamese thrusts went through Loc Ninh to the north and went right through An Loc.
The North Vietnamese quickly surrounded the 4,000 South Vietnamese soldiers defending An Loc, a small town 65 miles northwest of Saigon, North Vietnam's ultimate objective.
I was in command of the advisory group for the ARVN 5th Division.
U.S. Army Colonel Walter Ulmer, 43, from Bangor, Maine, went to An Loc in May.
I think I got your charge, Charlie. You about 3,500?
We were simply trying to do what we had to do to save the town and to defeat the North Vietnamese forces.
The North Vietnamese began pounding An Loc with as many as 4,000 artillery rounds a day.
What it was first a very desolate place. A lot of people were killed and were wounded and had no way of being evacuated from the town.
Many of those casualties occurred among the 3,000 civilian refugees driven from their homes by the North Vietnamese offensive.
There were civilians who had come in there because that was the only sanctuary, I guess, in the area.
The constant shelling made it difficult for helicopters to bring in supplies and reinforcements. Major Ken Ingram, 34, from Neto, West Virginia, flew in as a replacement American advisor.
No one could ever be prepared for what we saw when we landed. The helicopter was swamped with people. The Vietnamese soldiers were hanging onto the skids.
That kind of chaos was typical of the siege. Panicky South Vietnamese troops, backed up by a handful of American advisors.
In many instances, or in most instances, the American advisors were the coordinators of the air attacks.
In fact, it was American air power that kept the North Vietnamese from overrunning An Loc.
We knew the situation was that they were desperate, they needed close air support, that the enemy was attacking from multiple sides.
Air Force Captain Bob Zuhl, 27, from Trenton, New Jersey, flew giant B-52s over An Loc.
We actually had 84 500-pounders internally, and it was called Big Bombay load. And then you carried another 24 750-pounders on the wings. Each B-52 would bomb an area of 3 football fields long, and anything in that area was completely destroyed or pulverized.
When the B-52s came in, we were not happy. We were ecstatic. They were the only thing that probably could have saved us from the massive attacks that were all around the perimeter. And when those things came down, everything rocked.
The concussion, the noise was so loud that all you could do was just open your mouth so your eardrums wouldn't break, recite the Lord's Prayer, and hope one didn't fall on you.
Despite the massive air attacks, the North Vietnamese siege of An Loc continued into a second month.
After a while, maybe toward the beginning of June, water was running out. Medical supplies were running out. There was about a 48-hour period where we thought the odds of ever getting out of An Loc were really slim.
Our food was scarce, our water was scarce, even in the Division CP. If you're talking about a weight loss plan, I lost 30 pounds in 30 days.
To break the siege, the South Vietnamese sent a large rescue force up Route 13 from Saigon. The North Vietnamese, however, resisted the rescue column almost every step of the way.
It was one of the most intense battles that was fought in the war.
Covering the South Vietnamese attempt to break the An Loc siege was Bruce Dunning, then a 32-year-old CBS News correspondent.
They'd be fighting up and down the road. One day, the North Vietnamese would push a little bit down the road, and then the next day they'd push back into the seesaw back and forth. We could usually see the airstrikes. You'd see the South Vietnamese forces firing artillery and rockets, mortars at the enemy.
Inside An Loc, the American advisors waited and hoped.
We heard about that almost every day for a month. They were coming up Highway 13, and we thought today would perhaps be the day they would break through. And then something would happen and we get the word that they were ambushed, they just couldn't make it any farther, they just aren't going to break through.
Conditions inside An Loc continued to deteriorate.
The town was in a shambles. It was kind of a surrealistic environment. You'd almost think you were on the moon or somewhere. Everything was wrecked. Everything was wrecked. There were just a few pieces standing and some battered tanks and so forth.
There was illness, sickness, just unmitigated filth everywhere you looked, and nothing you could do about it.
There were graves all over the place. There were people of every age and shape. For the people in An Loc, this was as close to hell on earth as one could get, I think.
Finally, on June 8th, the South Vietnamese relief column broke through, ending the 67-day siege.
When they finally broke the siege and were able to get through on the road, and one of the advisors said to me, this is D-Day, this is An Loc's Normandy. It showed how relieved the American advisors were.
As a result of what happened at An Loc, several messages became clear.
The ARVN were able to stand against vicious North Vietnamese attacks, but only if American advisors and American air power were present.
The South Vietnamese held the North Vietnamese at bay for 2 months at the My Chan River in Quang Tri Province. Then, after 5 days of intense American naval and air bombardment, 10,000 South Vietnamese Marines, joined by their American advisors, stormed across the My Chan River.
It was the only war we had, and I was a self-appointed, self-proclaimed warrior, so I didn't want to miss it.
Marine Captain Ray Smith, 26, from Shidler, Oklahoma, was an American advisor who crossed the river with the South Vietnamese Marines.
In the initial stages of the counteroffensive, we had success, moved fairly well, moved fairly rapidly, captured a lot of equipment, but had a fight every day. Every fight ended in significant incoming artillery. All of us, Vietnamese Marines and Vietnamese Marine advisors alike, probably have the one most vivid memory we all have of that period is their artillery. We took a lot of casualties from artillery and mortars, but artillery especially.
Flying in support of the South Vietnamese offensive was almost every aircraft the U.S. had in theater, including huge B-52 bombers flown by men like Captain Bob Zuhl.
I was proud. I was proud to be an officer. I was proud to be a B-52 pilot. I was proud of what I did.
In the summer of 1972, Zuhl was bombing the North Vietnamese in Quang Tri Province.
Targets would change day by day based upon both the intelligence assessments as well as the forward air controllers who were constantly over the battlefield at that point in time.
It was not unusual to put in airstrike after airstrike after airstrike.
Forward Air Controller Lieutenant Darrell Whitcomb had plenty of targets for the smoke rockets that marked targets for the B-52s.
We sometimes became perhaps callous, perhaps cavalier, because of the amount of ordnance that we had available to us that we could put down.
But even with the help of the forward air controllers and the B-52s, it took the South Vietnamese most of July to push the North Vietnamese back.
The offensive took 5 or 6 weeks, I guess, to get back to the outskirts of Quang Tri City.
When the South Vietnamese reached the outskirts of the provincial capital of Quang Tri City on July 27th, their American advisors called in even more firepower.
It was about a 4-day bombardment with everything we had. Artillery, naval gunfire, and air. It was reduced essentially to a pile of rubble.
But when the South Vietnamese entered the city of 17,000 residents, they discovered that the North had dug in and was putting up stiff resistance.
The North Vietnamese would hold one side of what was a street, and we'd hold the other side of that same street. Both sides used grenades, very extensively. I remember many times in that city where it's just a continuous sound of grenades going off. They held us at that street. We moved not 1 meter officially for 5 or 6 days. It took us 5 or 6 days to get the first foothold across that first street.
2 companies of South Vietnamese Marines finally made it across the street, but at a heavy price.
I don't remember the exact number of casualties, but it was a lot. 50% in those two companies.
Once across the street, the Marines began moving cautiously through the city, one street at a time. Their ultimate objective, the ancient walled fortress of the Citadel at the center of the city.
You make progress. You make progress for 50 or 75 yards until you hit the next street. Vietnamese Marines were tremendous little fighters. I love them. I admire them. I'm proud to have served with them. They did not need my advice on how to fight.
By August 3rd, the South Vietnamese had fought their way to the Citadel. They took over the remains of a 3-story hotel 100 yards from the Citadel wall to use as an observation post.
I spent day and night the last 2.5 to 3 weeks of this fight in Quang Tri City in that observation post sticking up there. I was coordinating all the air for all of the battalions that were kind of converging on that point.
Despite the pounding they were taking from the air, the North Vietnamese had had almost 2 months to dig into the Citadel. They defended it ferociously for the rest of August and into September, because despite all the airstrikes, no one had yet been able to blow a hole in the Citadel's wall so the South Vietnamese Marines could get in.
The biggest problem was that we were so close to it that you couldn't hit it on the side you needed to hit it on to knock the hole in it. And if you asked a pilot to go around and come at the wall from the opposite direction, then he was flying right into you. And if he missed, you had it.
Smith put in a request for more accurate bombs.
I was asked to bring in some fighter bombers with laser-guided bombs. These are 2,000-pound bombs now, and slam a hole in one of the walls of that Citadel.
I was talking to one or another of those guys almost constantly. And that's mostly what we talked about, how to punch a hole in that thing.
We dropped, I believe it was 4 laser-guided 2,000-pound bombs into the south wall of the Citadel and just blew a big hole in it. I can see that explosion to this day.
The bombs on September 15th blew a hole big enough for the South Vietnamese to get through.
And before the day was over on the 16th, we had taken the whole Citadel.
An event Smith will never forget.
In the immediate sense, it was a culmination of 9 months of nearly constant bitter fighting for those of us who were there when the offensive started and had survived it all. I think my first reaction was great relief. My God, it's over.
Retaking the Citadel, and with it Quang Tri City, seemed to take the heart out of the North Vietnamese Easter offensive. By the end of October, they had been pushed back across the demilitarized zone.
The South Vietnamese and American victory in the Easter offensive was important because it seemed to validate the policies that were then ongoing.
What really turned the tide against the North Vietnamese was the massive introduction of American air power.
The failure of the Viet Cong Easter Offensive accelerated the peace talks between the North Vietnamese and the U.S. In January 1973, they finally signed a peace treaty that effectively ended all U.S. military involvement in Vietnam and left only the South Vietnamese Army to defend itself. 2 months later, the North Vietnamese crossed the demilitarized zone again, and this time for good.